aspect of racism and every aspect of using the prison system to control an entire population of people.
Yeah. And if I'm not mistaken, and again, this is something that I'm not extremely well versed on, but piling on top of that, if visitation is only on certain days during certain times, if we're talking about folks who would have to take off work, and we all know that there are a lot of jobs out there that are like, no, you can't have this time off. If you take this time off, you're fired, right? And the amount of time that you would have to take off to make a 5-hour one-way trip it's exorbitant.
Exactly. Yes, it's an absurd situation to put any family members in, especially when you know that visitation is one of the key aspects of keeping people healthy and motivated and able to feel like there's a reason to try and survive to when they're released. And so visitation is an incredibly important part. It's an incredibly important survival strategy, and that to make it so onerous on, and in particular so onerous on women and children, because that's a lot of the people who are doing the visitation is people's loved ones who generally tend to be female or femme-identified, who are doing a lot of this emotional work. There's just absolutely no way to justify it unless you allow for the fact that it's part of a system of white supremacy. Absolutely.
So one of the things that we are going to talk about a little bit later is we're going to talk about some prison reform. We're going to talk about some prison abolition. But before we get there, and before we talk about some of that stuff, I'd like to know from each of you, whether it is your personal opinion, whether it's your experience, like whatever the case may be, if you have something to add, what does, like when we talk about, and again, I'm mostly focusing on, transgender and gender nonconforming folks and intersex folks as well, if you can paint that picture as well in this. But what is justice or injustice, other than just the solitary confinement and things like that? Like there's a number of things that make up what justice or injustice for trans people in the prison system looks like. So Mick, what does that look like to you? What does trans justice? How can we make these things better? Or what are some of the things that are or items of injustice that a lot of trans prisoners face? Obviously, you've mentioned the solitary confinement and sexual assault, which does happen to a lot of people in prison, but particularly to trans people. But what are the other aggressions that trans people have to face within the prison system?
Well, I think so solitary confinement, overuse of solitary confinement and isolation, sexual violence, just everyday humiliation, everyday harassing comments about how people look, about people's identities. There's also, we've been seeing a lot of sort of de facto isolation of trans people from each other and trans people from other LGB people, that if a trans woman in a facility strikes up a friendship with a gay man, they'll automatically be separated because under the auspices that they have a sexual relationship, when that is possible, that's what they're doing, but also it's equally possible that they're forming community and a survival technique to survive this this trauma together. And so that's a type of intervention that SRLP sometimes makes with our clients as we try and appeal transfers or people being placed on each other's do not house with list on the basis that some CO has determined that a sexual relationship has happened when actually it's just a friendship. It's a strategy of trying to get through an ordeal together. There's also just a lot of very basic needs not being met. People often experience that if they're on any kind of hormones or trans-specific kind of medication or health care, that it's treated as a privilege as opposed to a medical need. And so it's easily they easily forget to bring it to medical roll call, or they give someone a substitute medication and say it's exactly the same thing. People get significantly less hormone levels than they get in the free world. And also, I've had several clients for whom the moment they have a co-occurring illness, all of their trans-specific healthcare gets stopped. So someone is on hormones, and all of a sudden, and she develops a breast cancer, for instance. Then all of a sudden they say, well, we can't give you hormones and treat you for breast cancer at the same time, even though there's absolutely no medical rationale for
right.
that. And then a huge issue that's been in the news a lot, thanks to some amazing individuals and their advocates, is access to surgeries, which is a huge issue for a lot of trans people. That at this point in time, I don't know of a single prison that will. When we make the decision to incarcerate people,
right.
it's sometimes referred to as a carceral bargain we make, that if we've decided that incarceration is something that we want to do, and it is a decision that we make as a society,
right.
then we become responsible for ensuring that basic minimum needs are met for people, so that they have medical health care, that they have access to mental health care, that they have clothing, that they have food. These are things that we
right.
have to provide people as part of our carceral bargain. And so prisons across the states have all held that surgical interventions for trans people are not part of that medical necessity. And we're beginning to have challenges from California and from Georgia and from Massachusetts, from women who have just really put themselves on the line and risked a lot by demanding that actually that surgery is needed for them. And the prison's responses to this has been to fight it tooth and nail and to find other pretexts for releasing these women rather than give them the surgeries that they need, and rather than house them appropriately as well.
Right. So, Reese, what, outside of a totally different system, with the current system that we're in, are there any other things that besides what Mick has mentioned, that kind of highlight the injustice for trans and gender nonconforming people? Or maybe, what does your picture of justice look like for people of a trans experience within the system?
Yeah. Well, I don't think it's possible for us to achieve justice within the context of prisons. I'll start there. And I also think to understand the impact of prisons on trans folks and trans lives, we have to take a step back and look at the impact of prisons, period, in the state of prisons in the U.S. And some really shocking things to me are, I'm in conversations a lot where people are saying, well, this system just doesn't work. This system just doesn't work. And I think we have to reframe that and say this system actually does work. It's built in the way that benefits private corporations, and it works for them. They didn't build a broken system. They built a system that works exactly as it's supposed to for them. And it's not justice. And so, today there are more people in the United States, more black folks imprisoned, the greater percentage of our population than South Africa did in apartheid, and more people than were living under slavery in the United States ever. So more black folks are in prison currently, which is really shocking to me. So I think we can't have this conversation, or really any conversations about trans justice, without talking about race and racism. So really, taking that perspective and entering there, to me, that there's already precedent that the system is broken. It's disproportionately ruining the lives of black and brown folks. And then we have all of these additional problems and forms of harassment for trans folks. So, Mick really covered it well with denial of medication and basic medical care, harassment, sexual assault. And I don't really know. We think as trans folks about violence, the kind of violence that demanding that folks use a binary gender marker to identify them through systems. That I think is so intensified in prisons, as you've talked about, folks not being placed in safe facilities that correspond with their gender identity. But, gender nonconforming folks, I think, are probably in one of the worst situations. And as we know from the last trans discrimination survey, gender nonconforming folks face really high rates, disproportionately high rates of discrimination and assault and these things. So, what's the answer for that? What's a gender appropriate facility in a binary prison system? And the answer that the system has developed is solitary confinement, which is inhumane. So as far as I'm concerned, to improve things, we can fight for, basic healthcare access and better treatment. We can expose mistreatment. I think that Ashley Diamond, who was held in prison in Georgia, has been incredibly courageous in sharing many pieces of her story. She also, sued the state of Georgia for medical care. So she is someone who has a really incredible story. The same with CC McDonald, folks who are daring to be public and expose the injustice that they've faced in prison.
Yeah. So, you brought up something about the that this is a system that works for them, right? And I mean, and you're right. When we talk about like the for-profit prison industry, this is a $5 billion industry. And I'm actually surprised at the number of people that are not aware, and maybe it's just because, we don't talk about it enough, but there are a number of people that are not aware that there is such a thing as a for-profit, a private prison, and that the statistics that they, spew are usually extremely skewed, that they're wrong, right? They try to claim that private prisons, are cheaper and that they increase recidivism and things like that. And in fact, what it ends up being is that they've made a deal that they want to keep these as packed as possible. I was doing some research, and apparently there are these guarantees. There's these capacity guarantees that are written into these contracts to where the state says, yes, we will keep it minimum at 80, 90, or even 100% capacity, which means there's an incentive to lock people up. And, and they found in a lot of studies that with private prisons that they're handing out more small infractions, extending their sentences. That makes them more costly as prisoners, that there is increased recidivism rate, and then even sometimes there are not just the lockup quotas that I mentioned, but that there's apparently a low crimes tax, for a lot of these states that aren't showing enough crime in their state. To me, like, even if this is all part of that systemic oppression, but this is also so much a part of capitalism that just blows my mind that there are just companies making money off of this legal form of slavery.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really, I think, jaw-dropping. And then when I hold it and I understand the economy that we live in, it fits what the economic picture of our country looks like.
Right.
And, these private prisons also make a lot of money from immigrant detainees. It's similarly privatized. And something that I've learned recently is from some friends of mine who live in Tennessee, in Nashville actually, who's been working for a nonprofit that basically helps folks find work after leaving prison. Many of those programs are even funded by the private prison. So the program she was working for was funded by Corrections Corporation of America. And after a few weeks on the job, she realized that the work that this nonprofit said they were doing did nothing to help people readjust, did nothing to help people find stability. And so even outside of the context of the private prison, with some of the things that you talked about, Eli, they're ensuring that folks stay in the system, that they cannot succeed. And, we also have some really major barriers through like legalized discrimination. We have boxes that you check on most job applications disclosing whether you have been in the prison system or not.